Imagine settling into the window seat you paid extra for on a long flight, ready for some peace, only to be confronted by an entitled father demanding you give it up for his child. That's exactly what happened to Ava Johnson, a young black woman just trying to enjoy her journey. When Ava calmly refused, the man attempted to publicly shame her, expecting her to yield. But things took a dramatic turn when the airline flight attendant firmly stood by Ava's side. Witness the intense confrontation escalate as the father's anger boils over, his behavior growing increasingly aggressive, leading to threats of removal from the plane. Did Ava finally give in to the pressure, or did the entitled father face the consequences of his outrageous actions? Stick around to see how this tense airport drama unfolds and find out exactly what happened next. Let us know in the comments if you've experienced something similar, and don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories. Ava Johnson let out a soft sigh of relief as she slid into the window seat, 14A, on the crowded Airbus A320. The familiar scent of recycled air and jet fuel filled her nostrils, a smell she associated with both the mild stress and the quiet anticipation of travel. She had specifically chosen this seat, paying the extra fee not just for the promise of cloud-strewn vistas during the long flight, but for the small pocket of perceived privacy it offered. The window was her sanctuary, a buffer against the usual jostle and cramped intimacy of air travel. Settling in, she tucked her carry-on neatly under the seat in front of her, pulled out her new noise-cancelling headphones, a recent splurge, and the novel she'd been saving. The flight ahead stretched for hours, and she craved the simple solitude of losing herself in a story, insulated from the typical cabin commotion. Around her, the plane buzzed with the controlled chaos of final boarding. Passengers wrestled with oversized bags, attempting to cram them into the overhead bins which slammed shut with echoing finality. Flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency through the narrow aisles, their voices calm but firm as they directed traffic and recited pre-flight instructions over the intercom. The murmur of conversations, the shuffling of feet, the crying of an infant somewhere further back, it all formed a familiar symphony of departure. Ava buckled her seatbelt with a reassuring click, opened her book to the first page, and consciously let the surrounding hubbub fade into a low, ignorable hum. She was already beginning to disconnect, her mind drifting towards the fictional world laid out in print. She barely registered the father and child making their way down the aisle, just another pair navigating the last-minute seating scramble, until they stopped directly beside her row. A deep, resonant voice suddenly cut through her concentration, sharp and expectant. "Excuse me," it commanded, though phrased almost like a polite inquiry. "I need you to move." Ava blinked, pulling her focus back from the page. She looked up into the face of a man towering slightly over her seat. He appeared to be in his mid to late 40s, dressed smartly in clothes that suggested expense, and carried an air of distinct impatience. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, a high-end watch glinted expensively under the fluorescent cabin lights, and his entire demeanor radiated a sense of entitlement, the bearing of someone accustomed to getting their way without question or delay. Standing beside him, almost hidden by his leg, was a little girl, no older than 6. She clutched a well-loved stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest, her eyes wide and anxious as she fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, carefully avoiding Ava's gaze. Ava hesitated, processing the abrupt demand. "I'm sorry?" she asked, needing clarification. The man, Richard Aldridge, she'd later noticed the name on a frequent flyer tag clipped to his sleek carry-on, let out an exaggerated sigh, as if explaining something painfully obvious to someone slow on the uptake. He gestured towards the empty aisle seat in her row. "My daughter," he stated, his voice lowering slightly, but losing none of its demanding edge, "needs the window seat. She gets anxious during flights." He delivered the explanation as if it were an irrefutable fact that automatically necessitated her compliance, leaving no room for negotiation or consideration of her own circumstances. Ava's eyebrows arched slightly. Her gaze flickered from the impatient man to the visibly nervous child, then back again. She understood anxiety. Travel could be stressful for anyone, let alone a small child. But his approach felt less like a request born of concern, and more like an order from someone who simply expected obedience. "I'm sorry," she repeated, keeping her voice even but injecting a note of firmness. "This wasn't just any seat, it was her seat. I paid extra for this specific seat." For a brief, almost imperceptible moment, Richard Aldridge looked genuinely surprised, as if the very concept of someone telling him no was entirely foreign. a glitch in the expected social matrix. Then, just as quickly, his expression hardened, annoyance replacing surprise. "She's a child," he reiterated, drawing the word out slowly, condescendingly, as though Ava hadn't grasped the fundamental point the first time. "Surely you understand." Oh, Ava understood perfectly. She understood that a grown man, clearly affluent enough to afford a Rolex, and what looked like a first-class leather briefcase stowed nearby, had somehow failed to plan adequately for his own daughter's documented travel needs. She understood he had simply assumed, based on what? Her age, her race, her gender, that she would readily relinquish her paid-for comfort without a second thought. She understood that if the roles were reversed, or if she presented differently, his approach might have been vastly different, perhaps even polite. The unspoken assumptions hanging in the air were almost palpable. She kept her voice calm, refusing to be baited into an emotional reaction. "I understand she's a child," Ava replied steadily, "but I also paid for my seat. If having a window was that critical for her comfort, perhaps you should have booked accordingly when you made your reservations." Richard's lips tightened into a thin, humorless line. A disbelieving scoff escaped him. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head slightly. Then, deciding his private displeasure wasn't sufficient, he raised his voice, ensuring the passengers in the surrounding rows could clearly hear. "This," he announced, gesturing vaguely towards Ava, "is exactly what's wrong with people today. Just no basic decency, no consideration." The words hung heavy in the confined space, a deliberate, calculated move, designed to isolate Ava and paint her as the unreasonable party. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some turned their heads, openly curious. Others darted quick, sideways glances at Ava, their expressions a mixture of mild curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. Ava felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. She knew precisely what he was doing, leveraging social pressure, attempting to shame her into submission. Her stomach twisted into a knot of indignation and frustration. Why was it always the person standing their ground who was accused of lacking decency, rather than the person making unreasonable demands? Before she could formulate a response, trying to keep the rising anger from her voice, a shadow moved into the aisle beside them. A crisp, navy blue uniform came into view. A flight attendant had arrived, drawn by the man's raised voice, and the palpable tension radiating from row 14. The attendant, a woman in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, paused beside the row, her gaze sweeping assessingly between Ava, still seated firmly by the window, and Richard Aldridge, standing rigidly beside her, his arms now crossed defiantly over his chest. The stage was set for the next act in this unexpected airplane drama. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sandra Wallace, possessed an air of calm authority, honed by years of navigating the unpredictable currents of air travel. Her posture was erect, her navy blue uniform impeccably crisp, and her expression, while initially neutral, held a sharpness in the eyes that suggested she missed very little. She stopped beside the row, her presence immediately drawing the focus of the conflict. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice steady and professional, addressing both Ava and Richard but looking primarily at the still-standing man. Before Ava could even open her mouth to explain, Richard Aldridge jumped in, eager to present his narrative first. "Yes, there is," he declared, straightening up slightly and gesturing towards Ava, with barely concealed annoyance. "This woman is refusing to give up her seat for my daughter." He angled his body slightly, ensuring Sandra got a clear view of the small, anxious-looking child still clutching her stuffed rabbit. Sandra's gaze briefly flickered towards the little girl, a flicker of professional sympathy perhaps, before settling back on Richard. Her expression remained unreadable. "Sir," she began, her tone even, "passengers are generally assigned specific seats." Richard cut her off, impatience coloring his tone. "I know that," he snapped. He then launched into the explanation he'd already given Ava, his voice carrying, ensuring those nearby continued to listen. "My daughter gets very anxious during flights. She needs the window seat to feel calm. I simply asked this young lady," he stressed the young slightly, perhaps another subtle attempt at diminishing Ava's standing, "to switch with her. It's the decent thing to do, but she refused." Sandra turned her head slightly towards Ava, her eyes posing a silent question. "Ma'am, did you book this particular seat, 14A?" Ava nodded, meeting Sandra's gaze directly. "Yes, I did. I paid the additional fee for a window seat assignment when I bought my ticket. Sandra nodded once, acknowledging the confirmation, then turned her full attention back to Richard. Her professional calm remained firmly in place. Sir, this passenger is in the seat she was assigned and paid for. We cannot compel her to move. Richard scoffed, clearly not expecting the flight attendant to so readily validate Ava's position. I understand the rules, he said, making air quotes with his fingers, but I'm asking you as a representative of this airline to help facilitate a solution here. Surely customer service means going the extra mile, especially when a child's comfort is involved. It's about doing the right thing, not just sticking rigidly to seat assignments. He presented it as an appeal to higher values, casting Sandra's adherence to policy as inflexible bureaucracy hindering basic human kindness. Sandra inhaled slowly, the slight rise and fall of her shoulders the only outward sign of her dwindling patience. Sir, customer service also involves respecting the choices and rights of all our passengers. It does not extend to forcing one passenger to relinquish a seat they specifically paid for to accommodate another, regardless of the circumstances. Her voice remained level, but the steel underneath was becoming more apparent. Your assigned seats are. She glanced briefly at a printout she held, 14D and 14E, on the aisle. Richard's face began to flush, a tide of red creeping up his neck. Unassigned. He wasn't just being denied. He was being denied publicly, and by the airline staff he clearly expected to enforce his will. He seemed incapable of accepting this outcome. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on his public shaming tactic, turning slightly to address the captive audience in the surrounding rows again. This isn't about rules, he declared, his voice rising again, drawing more eyes. This is about basic human decency, about kindness, about a grown woman. His eyes flicked back to Ava with open disapproval, refusing to show a little compassion for a frightened child. Is this what we've come to? His words were designed to inflict maximum discomfort, to paint Ava as cold-hearted and selfish. Ava felt the weight of the stares more intensely now. Some passengers looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others watched with undisguised interest, perhaps debating the merits of his argument in their own minds. Whispers rustled through the nearby rows. Ava gripped the armrests tighter, her knuckles white. It was infuriating, this attempt to manipulate the situation, to twist her simple assertion of her right into an act of cruelty. She wanted to shout, to defend herself more forcefully, but she instinctively knew that losing her composure was exactly what he wanted. It would validate his narrative of her being unreasonable. Sandra, however, remained unmoved by his theatrics. I understand your concern for your daughter, sir, she said, her voice cutting cleanly through his rhetoric. If you would like, once boarding is complete, I can check my manifest to see if there happen to be any unoccupied window seats available elsewhere on the plane. But I reiterate, I will not be asking this passenger, she gestured firmly towards Ava, to leave the seat she has reserved and paid for. Richard's jaw tightened visibly. He turned his glare back onto Ava, leaning slightly closer. So, you're really not going to move, not even for a child? His voice was lower now, laced with incredulous contempt. Ava met his stare, her voice quiet but unwavering. I paid for this seat, she repeated, the simple fact her only necessary defense. I'm staying in it. Richard let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor, shaking his head as if she were beyond comprehension. He looked around at the other passengers again, seeking validation for his outrage. Can you believe this? He asked the cabin at large, though no one answered directly. A grown woman, refusing to swap seats with a little girl. The murmuring in the cabin grew slightly louder. Ava could feel the social pressure intensifying, the unspoken expectation that she should be the bigger person, the one to yield to avoid further conflict. It was a familiar, exhausting dynamic. Why did being the bigger person so often mean letting someone else disregard your boundaries? Sandra must have sensed the shift, or perhaps she simply decided enough was enough. She took a small, deliberate step closer to Ava's seat, positioning herself subtly between Ava and Richard, a quiet but clear gesture of support. Sir, she said, her voice dropping slightly but gaining a new level of firmness, I am going to ask you one last time to please take your assigned seat now, so we can prepare for departure. Richard took a deep, sharp breath, his nostrils flaring. He seemed momentarily silenced by Sandra's unyielding stance. His eyes darted around, perhaps realizing the tide of passenger opinion wasn't swinging his way as decisively as he'd hoped. Then, defeated but defiant, he muttered something under his breath. Ava couldn't catch the beginning, a low, angry rumble, but the final word, spat out with venomous clarity, was unmistakable, typical. The single word landed like a slap in the charged atmosphere. Ava's stomach plummeted. She knew that word, knew the ugly weight and history it carried when aimed at a black woman by a disgruntled white man. Her breath caught in her throat. Sandra's entire posture changed in an instant. She went rigid, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. The professional calm evaporated, replaced by something icier, sharper. For a second, the ambient noise in that section of the plane seemed to cease, as if everyone nearby had heard it, had understood the unspoken implication. Sandra straightened her shoulders, her eyes locking onto Richard's with cold fire. "I suggest," she said, her voice dangerously low and clipped, "you be very careful about what you're implying, sir." The energy in the cabin shifted again, thick with a new, more volatile tension. Just then, before Richard could respond to Sandra's warning, another voice cut through the air from a row behind them. "Hey," she said, she paid for her seat. "Leave her alone." The unexpected voice from behind, firm and clear. "Hey," she said, she paid for her seat. "Leave her alone," added another layer to the already thick tension. Ava subtly turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the speaker, a man in his middle years, wearing a simple green hoodie and glasses, sitting in an aisle seat a couple of rows back. He wasn't looking at Richard. His gaze was fixed on Sandra, seemingly offering support for her authority. Sandra gave the man a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before refocusing her steely gaze on Richard Aldridge. Her earlier warning about his implications hung in the air. "Sir," she stated, her voice now devoid of any warmth, purely professional, but carrying an undeniable edge of command. "I need you to lower your voice and take your assigned seat immediately." Richard seemed momentarily thrown by the passenger's intervention and Sandra's hardening tone, but his sense of indignation quickly overrode any caution. He scoffed, shaking his head again as if surrounded by fools. "Lower my voice. Are you serious? This is utterly ridiculous." He gestured around, desperation creeping into his attempts to rally support. "Doesn't anyone else here think this is wrong? That basic courtesy has just gone out the window. We're talking about a small child's comfort on a long flight." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, but crucially, no one voiced agreement with him. The tide had turned. His aggressive tactics coupled with his offensive typical remark had likely eroded any sympathy he might have initially garnered. He wasn't coming across as a concerned father anymore, but as an entitled bully. Seeing his appeals fall flat seemed to fuel his frustration further. He stubbornly held his ground in the aisle, arms still crossed, a thunderous expression on his face. "This isn't about courtesy anymore, sir," Sandra said, her voice dangerously quiet. "This is about following crew instructions and maintaining order on this aircraft. You are delaying our departure." It was at that moment that another uniformed figure appeared, approaching purposefully from the front galley. Taller and broader shouldered than Sandra, the second flight attendant moved with a calm but imposing presence. His name tag read Javier. He stopped beside Sandra, assessing the situation instantly. "Is there a problem here, Sandra?" he asked, his voice polite, but with an underlying firmness that mirrored hers. Sandra didn't take her eyes off Richard. "Not yet, Javier," she replied evenly. "But I was just explaining to this passenger that if he continues to refuse to take his assigned seat and follow crew instructions, we will need to escalate the situation." Javier nodded slowly, his gaze now fixed on Richard. The arrival of a second crew member, especially a male one, often shifted the dynamic in such confrontations. It signaled a unified front and a more serious level of intervention. This was no longer just a disagreement. It was rapidly becoming an official incident. Ava watched the unfolding scene, a silent observer caught in the eye of a storm not of her making. She could see the internal conflict warring within Richard. He was cornered. Every instinct seemed to scream at him to keep fighting, to assert the dominance he clearly felt was his due. But the reality of the situation, two firm flight attendants, unsupportive fellow passengers, and the implicit threat of more serious consequences, was beginning to dawn. Yet, yielding was not in his nature. Men like Richard didn't back down. They doubled down or looked for another angle. Instead of moving towards his seat, a flicker of something, rage, spite, a final desperate attempt to assert control, crossed his face. In a move that stunned Ava and drew gasps from nearby passengers, Richard suddenly uncrossed his arms and took a step towards her row. He braced his hand on the top of the seat in front of hers, leaning in slightly, invading her already limited personal space. The aggression in his posture was palpable. "You must be feeling pretty proud of yourself right now," he sneered, his voice low and dripping with venom, clearly intended only for her ears but radiating palpable hostility. Ava didn't flinch, didn't respond. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Though her heart hammered against her ribs, she simply raised an eyebrow, holding his furious gaze. Before he could say more, Sandra and Javier reacted instantly. "Sir, step away from the passenger's seat now," Sandra commanded, her voice sharp and loud, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Javier moved simultaneously, positioning himself squarely between Richard and Ava's row. "Sir," Javier said, his voice calm but radiating absolute authority, "you need to return to your assigned seat immediately. This is your final warning." Richard straightened up, his face contorted with fury and disbelief. He looked from Javier to Sandra, then back to Ava, as if searching for a crack in their resolve. He was teetering on the edge. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue further, perhaps to unleash another insult. But then, seemingly realizing he had pushed too far, a sliver of self-preservation kicked in. He clamped his mouth shut, with one last, withering glare directed at Ava, a look filled with pure, unadulterated resentment. He finally turned away. But as he turned, just before taking a step back towards his own row, he couldn't resist one final parting shot. He muttered it under his breath, not quite loud enough for the whole cabin, perhaps, but perfectly audible to Sandra, Javier, and Ava herself. It was a crude, derogatory term, aimed squarely at Ava, laced with racial and sexist spite. The effect was instantaneous. Any remaining shred of professional restraint vanished from Sandra's expression. Javier didn't even hesitate. He immediately reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, raising it to his mouth. His voice was clear and decisive, cutting through the sudden, absolute silence that had fallen over the nearby rows. "Captain, this is Javier, in the main cabin. We have a situation with a disruptive passenger in row 14, requiring immediate ground assistance for removal." And just like that, with those few words echoing into the radio, Richard Aldridge's flight was over before it had even truly begun. The point of no return had been crossed, triggered by his own inability to accept no, and his final, hateful remark. The air in the cabin, already thick with tension, seemed to solidify in the seconds following Javier's radio transmission. The quiet crackle from his radio, followed by the captain's brief acknowledgement, "Roger that, Javier, keep him forward near door 1 left. Ground crew and security are being notified," felt unnaturally loud in the sudden, almost breathless silence that had enveloped the surrounding rows. Passengers who had been whispering fell silent, their eyes wide, now fully comprehending the gravity of the situation. Necks craned, people leaned forward subtly in their seats, all attention fixed on row 14, and the man whose belligerence had just crossed a critical line. Richard Aldridge stood frozen for a moment, the color draining slightly from his face, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. It seemed the reality, the finality, of his imminent removal from the flight was only just hitting him. His earlier bluster evaporated, leaving behind a raw, exposed indignation, mixed perhaps with a dawning sense of panic. His daughter, sensing the drastic shift in her father's demeanor, and the focused attention of the uniformed crew, pressed herself closer against his leg, her small face buried in the worn fur of her stuffed rabbit. Her wide, frightened eyes darted nervously between her father and the stern-faced flight attendants. Sandra and Javier moved with swift, professional coordination. There was no more negotiation, no more warnings. Javier took a position slightly blocking the aisle towards the rear of the plane, while Sandra stepped directly in front of Richard. "Sir," Sandra said, her voice calm but absolutely firm, leaving no room for argument, "I need you to gather your personal belongings now. All of them. You and your daughter will be deplaning." Richard stared at her, speechless for a moment. His jaw worked silently, as if searching for words of protest, denial, or perhaps even apology, but none came. The fight seemed to have finally gone out of him, replaced by the dawning, humiliating reality of his situation. "Sir," Javier repeated, his tone equally resolute, "please collect your items. We need to escort you to the jet bridge." There was a collective intake of breath from nearby passengers. This wasn't just a dressing down anymore, this was an ejection. Richard remained motionless for another second, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape hatch, a way to rewind the last 10 minutes. But there was none. The impassive faces of the flight attendants, the shocked or disapproving stares of his fellow passengers, the quiet fear radiating from his own child. It all coalesced into an undeniable conclusion. He had gone too far. Slowly, almost painfully, like a machine grinding to a halt, Richard Aldridge began to comply. His movements were stiff, jerky with resentment and embarrassment. He reached awkwardly into the overhead bin, pulling down the sleek carry-on bag that had earlier seemed a symbol of his status, now just luggage belonging to a man being kicked off a plane. He fumbled briefly with the buckle of his daughter's small backpack resting on the empty middle seat. His hands trembled slightly. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, his gaze fixed somewhere on the cabin floor, or the seat back in front of him. He knelt briefly to retrieve something from under the seat, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The entire process felt agonizingly slow, each movement magnified by the surrounding silence. Ava watched, not with triumph, but with a profound sense of weariness. This entire ugly spectacle, stemming from a simple refusal to yield a prepaid seat, felt utterly exhausting and unnecessary. Seeing the little girl, now silently weeping into her rabbit as her father gathered their things, Ava felt a pang of something akin to pity, not for the man, but for the child caught in the crossfire of his entitlement and temper. "Let's go, sir," Javier prompted gently but firmly, gesturing towards the front of the aircraft. Richard straightened up, holding his bag in one hand, and taking his daughter's small hand tightly in the other. He took a deep, shuddering breath. For a fleeting instant, his eyes met Ava's across the empty seats. There was no apology in his gaze, only a lingering residue of bitterness and humiliation. He seemed about to say something, his lips parting slightly, but then he just shook his head almost imperceptibly, a final, defeated gesture, and turned towards the front. Sandra led the way, with Javier bringing up the rear, effectively boxing Richard and his daughter in. They walked slowly up the aisle. Passengers averted their gazes, pretending to be engrossed in magazines or the safety card, though Ava knew everyone was watching the quiet procession. The silence was broken only by the soft shuffle of their feet on the carpet, and the little girl's muffled sobs. As they disappeared through the doorway towards the jet bridge, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the cabin. The whispering started almost immediately, hushed but audible. "Can you believe that guy?" someone muttered a few rows ahead. "Serves him right," another voice added from across the aisle. The woman in the green hoodie who had spoken up earlier simply shook her head, exchanging a look with her seatmate that spoke volumes. The overwhelming sentiment seemed to be relief that the confrontation was over, mixed with disapproval of Richard's behavior. Sandra returned a minute later, her professional composure fully restored, though perhaps with a hint of weariness around her eyes. She paused briefly by Ava's row. "Are you all right, ma'am?" she asked quietly. Ava managed a small nod, finally allowing herself to exhale fully, releasing tension she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yes, thank you, Sandra." "And Javier?" Her voice felt a little shaky. "If you need anything at all during the flight, please don't hesitate to let us know," Sandra added, offering a small reassuring smile, before moving on to continue her duties, helping to restore a sense of normalcy to the cabin. Ava leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The adrenaline dump left her feeling strangely drained. She wasn't happy about what had happened. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone publicly humiliated, even someone who had behaved as badly as Richard Aldridge. There was certainly no joy in seeing a child upset, but regret. No, she didn't regret standing her ground. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply refused to be bullied, refused to relinquish something that was rightfully hers, because someone else demanded it with aggression and entitlement. The fact that it had escalated to such a dramatic conclusion spoke volumes about him, not her. She finally turned to look out the window she had paid for, the window that had inadvertently become the catalyst for so much drama. Outside, the ground crew moved with routine efficiency, seemingly oblivious to the human conflict that had just played out inside the metal tube. The airport hummed with activity. Soon the plane door would close, the engines would spool up, and they would take off, leaving Richard Aldridge and his unfortunate daughter behind. Ava took another deep breath. It was just a seat, but sometimes holding on to your small piece of ground, quietly and firmly, was everything. Ava's story reminds us that standing your ground doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes quiet firmness is the most powerful response. In life we encounter people who feel entitled to our space, our time or our rights, often trying to shame or pressure us into yielding. But holding on to your boundaries, calmly and respectfully asserting what's rightfully yours, like Ava did with her seat, isn't selfish, it's necessary self-respect. It shows that true strength isn't about demanding your way, but about maintaining your dignity even when challenged. What did you take away from Ava's experience on that flight? I genuinely love reading your perspectives and hearing about your own moments like these, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. If these kinds of stories resonate with you, hitting that like button and subscribing really helps us keep sharing them. Thanks so much for watching and being part of our story community.